Nationally, there were 1,887 auctions held over the weekend, returning a clearance rate of 62.2%. Sydney held 731 auctions with a clearance rate of 62.7%. Melbourne held 672 auctions with a clearance rate of 69.8%. Brisbane held 146 auctions with a clearance rate of 53.4%. Adelaide held 57 auctions with a strong clearance rate of 75.4%. And the ACT held 56 auctions with a clearance rate of 64.3%. Joining me now is Angus Moore from REA Group. Angus, looks like clearance rates still holding up pretty strong as we get deeper into spring.
Yeah, that's right, Ed. Pretty solid weekend all round, certainly pretty busy, and we're seeing pretty strong clearance rates, particularly in Melbourne this weekend, though, that's really been pretty consistent throughout late winter and into spring. We've seen a real pickup in activity, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. Both had a very busy end to winter, and that looks like it's continuing into spring, and conditions have remained pretty solid.
How much traffic are you getting on the website right now? Is there a lot more interest starting to pick up?
We have seen the number of highly engaged buyers pick up a bit over the past few months. Partly that's seasonal. We'd expect to see that as we ramp into spring. But, if we're looking kind of over the broader trend, demand remains pretty solid. It's not what we were seeing in spring 2021, early 2022, when conditions were incredibly hot. But we are seeing relatively solid demand, and certainly a bit better than we were seeing, say, 12 months ago.
And how long are properties taking to sell at the moment?
Yeah, a pretty consistent story with kind of what we're seeing across metrics, really. Seeing the same in clearance rates, seeing the same in demand. We have seen it stabilise over the past sort of 6 months or so, particularly Sydney and Melbourne. It's actually trended down a little in the last few months. Now, it can be pretty volatile month to month, so, cautious about looking too much at 1 month's movements, but it does look like we've seen it stabilise in the past, say, 6 to 12 months at about, 45 to 48 days nationally, depending on which month you're looking at. That's longer than what we were seeing in spring 2021, but again, it's probably improved a little from where we were late last year.
Now, looking at your auction stats, about 613 properties were sold prior to auction over this recent weekend. Is that kind of a developing trend here?
Yeah, we have seen maybe a little bit of a pickup, mostly in Sydney and Melbourne, not so much in some of the other capitals, though of course some of the other capitals tend to be a bit lighter on the auction side anyway. That would be consistent with the fact that we are seeing homes in Sydney and Melbourne sell a little bit quicker. If we're seeing those sales happen sooner, we'd expect to see a few more getting sold prior to auction. So I think it's one to watch as we head further into spring.
Now, in the last week, there's been some big housing announcements from both New South Wales and Victorian governments. I guess it's an important thing to improve the level of housing supply in Australia, right?
Yeah, so certainly they were the big news last week in housing, and I think it's quite pleasing to see that the focus is on building more homes. We're seeing that from the National Cabinet with the target to build 1.2 million homes over the next 5 years to Victoria's target to build 800,000 over the next decade. Similarly in New South Wales, we saw funding for infrastructure to support new homes, changes to the way planning's done, targets for social and affordable homes. So I think we're heading in the right direction, and the focus is at least in the right areas.
Yep, so a big commitment here to build the homes, but are we actually going to reach those targets?
That is the big question, of course. To be seen. Predicting these things is hard. At the moment, it looks tough. On current pace, we're not kind of keeping track with that. To put some numbers around it, nationally at the moment, we're completing about 170 to 180,000 homes a year. That's obviously going to fall short of 1.2 million. In Victoria, we're building about 60,000 homes a year. Again, that's going to fall short of the sort of 80,000 needed to build 800,000 over a decade. So at the moment, we're not keeping pace. But I don't think those targets are absurdly optimistic either. If we wind back, say, 6 years, at kind of the peak of when we were building detached and attached dwellings, we were hitting that sort of pace. So it's certainly feasible.
It's doable.
But at the moment, it doesn't look like we're hitting it.
And the construction sector's kind of been struggling as well recently too, right?
That's right. That's a big part of the story for why we're seeing those slower completions at the moment. It has been really hard in the construction sector. To put some kind of key numbers around it, construction costs have been growing incredibly quickly. Over the past sort of 12 to 18 months, we saw at peak inflation in building costs at 20% or more, which is eye-wateringly quick. Now, it looks like we're getting through the worst of that. It looks like construction prices are starting to stabilise. So that's probably a good news story as we head out and start to try and hit these targets.
Angus Moore from REA Group, thanks so much for your time.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me, Ed.